With Sega's arcade games often being on the cutting edge, home versions of these games were sometimes scaled back heavily, or even changed entirely. This was especially true during the 8 and 16-bit eras, where Sega would either redesign an IP entirely for home release, or radically change its structure and assets. In this episode, we're going to look at some of Sega's tinkering with their arcade and home games that shared some of the same source material. I hope you enjoy Sega arcade games that were very different at home. In 1990, we'd see the fruits of a new collaboration between Sega and Michael Jackson released in the arcade. Developed by AM1 and running on Sega's System 18 arcade board, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was an isometric mix of run and gun and beat-em-up gameplay. Based on the movie of short stories of the same name, it focuses on the smooth criminal portion that has our hero saving kidnapped children from the evil Mr. Big. You have charged melee attacks to deal with regular enemies, as well as the ability to transform into a robot with much more firepower and killing potential for a short while. There is also a nuke attack that allows you to literally dance your enemies to death. The game graphically excels with some pretty solid animation and a screen that is often filled with numerous enemies and set pieces. The visuals were aided by music tracks from Michael Jackson himself, encompassing many of his biggest hits up until that point. The arcade cabinet featured 3-player simultaneous co-op multiplayer, a feature that made the game not only easier, but a lot more fun. When Sega released Moonwalker on the Sega Genesis that same year, it was clear that it was developed by a different team with a very different vision. Now a single-player side-scrolling action platformer, its new mechanics were centered around a new exploration element of actually not just saving children, but having to find them as well. You'll need to check windows, car trunks, trash cans, and doors to find them all before you have a chance to move on to the next level. Though the graphics here share some of the assets of the arcade game, the animation and art style have some pretty big differences that make it its own unique game. Jackson's music would again be the centerpiece of the audio presentation, with many of the same hits returning. This game was featured prominently in the early days of the Genesis advertising, with Sega banking on Michael Jackson's immense popularity to help get new customers on board. It worked, and with the Genesis platform doing so well in the West, a sequel was planned. But in 1993, child molestation charges rocked the star's public image, causing Sega to distance themselves. A Sega Master System game was also produced in 1990 that is based on the Genesis release. It has the same overall structure and design elements, and is surprisingly close to the 16-bit source material.
Michael!
1986 Enduro Racer is an early superscalar motorbike racing game done on the same hardware as Hang On, this time featuring a more dynamic track that is loaded with obstacles, as well as hills and jumps that need to be navigated to get to the finish line. It was much harder too, with the other riders often being the least of your worries. A missed jump often meant being sent into a pile of rocks or other rubble, resulting in an immediate wreck. The time limit was brutal too, demanding a near-perfect race to make it to the next checkpoint. Both the graphics and sound were great for the era, and the arcade sit-down unit came in a standard and deluxe cabinet, with the latter having handlebars you can pull up on to aid in getting better height with your jumps. When Sega brought Enduro Racer to the Master System in 1987, they'd radically changed the gameplay and graphics. Now with an angled overhead perspective similar to games like Paperboy, this changes everything about the experience. The sense of speed is completely gone, and with the track obstacles being significantly reduced, so is the challenge. It's not unreasonable to claim that many skilled gamers can defeat this game in one sitting quite easily. Sega never seemed afraid to bring its superscalers home to the Master System, with games like Outrun, Afterburner, Thunderblade, and even Galaxy Force attempting the third-person pseudo-3D perspective. Further changes would be made between the Japanese and Western releases of Enduro Racer for the Master System. North America and Europe would have their cart sizes cut in half, losing 5 of the 10 tracks in the Japanese release. I don't really need to give a lot of detail about our next game. AM2's 1994 arcade classic Virtua Fighter 2 stormed onto the scene and redefined what a fighting game could be. Its gorgeous 3D presentation was absolutely unmatched in the arcade in 1994, and the lightning-fast gameplay took over Japanese arcades for years to follow. It's one of Sega's most successful arcade machines it ever produced, and one of my favorite fighting games of all time. In 1995, everyone and their grandmother expected a Sega Saturn version of the game, and Sega delivered a fantastic high-resolution 60 frames per second experience on that hardware that was truly impressive. Of course, what nobody expected was 1996 Genesis and Mega Drive versions of Virtua Fighter 2. Completely redesigned in a 2D engine, it tried to bring the arcade gameplay home in 16-bit form. This switch to 2D had radical changes to just not the visuals of the game, but also significantly changing how it plays. It's now much slower with significant reduction in animation. You'd also lose the 2 new fighters, see a reduction in moves for each character, and get a major reduction in voice samples and sound effects. Virtua Fighter 2 for the Genesis is far from the worst fighting game on the system, but the cutbacks here can't be easily overlooked. I admire the attempt at bringing home such a powerful arcade game to much lesser hardware, but you have to ask what Sega was thinking. I suppose with Saturn circling the drain in the West in 1997, Sega was desperate to get anything out they thought would sell.
Fight 1, ready, go!
With Sega's arcade ninja game Shinobi doing so well, we'd see a spiritual follow-up in 1989 called Shadow Dancer. Developed by AM1 and designed on the Sega System 18, this side-scrolling action platformer continues the tried-and-true gameplay of the original Shinobi, now with the added assistance of a canine companion that can be used to help attack enemies. It adds a fair bit of pizzazz visually, with more parallax scrolling, more animation, and larger, more dynamic level design. It was a fantastic follow-up to the first Shinobi, and though it had no direct story correlation, it is considered part of that universe. When Sega brought Shadow Dancer home in 1990 to the Genesis and Mega Drive platforms, a great many things would see change. First, it would now be called Shadow Dancer: The Secret of Shinobi, with the story being rewritten to have the main character from Shinobi and Revenge of Shinobi, Joe Musashi, returning here. The Japanese version would differ in this story even further, with Joe's son Hayate being the central character, with further changes in relationships and timelines. Also changed is the level design and layout, with new enemy types and animations present throughout the entire game. Even the main character sprite would see heavy modification in both shape, size, and color. Graphically, it makes excellent use of the platform's graphics capabilities, with tons of parallax scrolling, great color use, and fast fluid gameplay. The music is solid as well, with a distinct sound that separates itself from other Shinobi games. I might even go so far as to say, the home version was better than the arcade. Sega would expand the Shadow Dancer namesake further by porting the arcade to the Master System in 1991. It attempts to capture the look and feel of its big brother, leaving much of the level design and boss battles intact as well. The dog is removed and made a special attack, and it's riddled with sprite flicker, but it's as close to the arcade as you're going to get on a Sega system. In 1989's Cyber Police SWAT was an AM1 developed run-and-gun side-scrolling action game developed on the System 16 arcade platform. You start as a beat cop trying your best to rid Liberty City of criminals, which infest every nook and cranny of the first few stages. Your hard work doesn't go unnoticed, and is rewarded with being accepted into the Enhanced Special Weapons and Tactics, or ESWAT, where you are given a special exosuit that gives you access to better weaponry and the ability to take more damage. This damage will cause your suit to wear down over time and break apart, leaving you open to more punishment. The graphics are well animated and have great color use, especially the larger bosses. It features 2-player co-op multiplayer, which helps playability and the intense difficulty level. Gameplay here is sort of done in the mold of the original Shinobi arcade, where you are fighting pretty much in a linear left-to-right scrolling environment, but have the ability to jump to the upper portions of the screen when needed. When Sega brought SWAT home in 1990, it was given a new name, now called SWAT City Under Siege. It retained some of the elements of the arcade, such as the side-scrolling run-and-gun mechanics, but radically changed the overall design of the stages, enemies, and bosses. Each stage now has far more verticality to its makeup, giving you multiple levels to either climb up or descend. You again start out as a regular cop doing your job bringing criminals to justice, when you are recruited into SWAT and given your own exosuit. The power-ups in the arcade become regular weaponry here that can be switched on the fly, allowing you more choice in how you get rid of your enemies. You also have the ability to fly via a jetpack that has limited fuel, adding a ton of variety to some of the later stages. Stages are also more varied in the home release from the get-go, and rarely look the same or repeat assets. The two-player co-op is lost, but with so much being changed for the better, this is a rare case where the home release is a significantly better overall game. A Sega Master System version was released in 1990 as well, keeping much closer to the arcade in gameplay style. It's a lot faster here though, feeling more like a Contra release than anything else. Our last game is actually a bit of a twist, as the release of the home game came before the arcade version. With the release of Jurassic Park in theaters in 1993, everyone knew it was gonna be a blockbuster hit. Sega was quick to snap up the rights to the property, and enlisted Blue Sky Software to bring home a Sega Genesis and Mega Drive edition. Using set pieces and characters from the movie, it would be a run-and-gun platformer where you can play as a human or a velociraptor. It was a damn hard game that could put off newbies with its high difficulty level and cheap deaths, but it had a great look to it and superb animation and background detail. It sold exceptionally well, and was so popular that a follow-up title, Jurassic Park Rampage Edition, was released the following year. This one picks right up where the first left off, and incorporates numerous gameplay and design improvements that really help the overall experience. There are also changes to the graphical style that improve the already impressive animation. The Jurassic Park license proved so lucrative for Sega that they internally developed a Sega CD game in 1994 under the same name. Jurassic Park for the Sega CD would not follow the lead of the cartridge versions of the game, and instead would be an entirely different experience with the mechanics of a point-and-click adventure. Heavily utilizing the full motion video of the CD-ROM format, you are given the task of recovering dinosaur eggs that were spread all over the island from the movie. You'll need to track and learn about multiple dinosaur species along the way, in what was surprisingly a robust adventure. Sega employed the same real-life paleontologist from the film to help with the production. There was even an 8-bit edition for the Game Gear and Master System released in 1993 and developed internally at Sega. It's a combination of a few genres, such as a side-scrolling platformer and an on-rail shooter. The gameplay here isn't particularly memorable, but you just have to love all that gorgeous parallax scrolling going on in a few of its stages. It's the weakest of the Jurassic Park games from Sega, and one I wouldn't mess around with outside of trying it in an emulator. Sega wouldn't be Sega if they didn't have an arcade game ready for the masses with a popular IP. And in 1994, Jurassic Park would be released on the Sega System 32 platform, developed by the soon-to-be immortal team behind Sega Rally Championship, Sega AM3. This two-player co-op first-person rail shooter has you taking a trip back to the island in the movie, where you must capture the newly free beast and set back up the island security system. These guys won't come quietly, however, and you'll be attacked by everything under the sun. The superscalar presentation here was awesome with fast and fluid visuals that still rocked in 1994. Hell, I still think it looks great today. You remain in a constant state of movement here, and the game rarely gives you more than a few seconds of rest in between attacks. The deluxe arcade cabinet was a 2-seater bench that moves and shakes to the action, with a massive set of speakers making the sound effects a huge part of the experience. It isn't a light gun game as you might expect, instead using a flight stick style interface with an on-screen targeting reticle. Despite the game being popular and Sega having the rights to Jurassic Park for years after, this one would never make a showing on any home console. I hope you guys enjoyed Sega arcade games that were very different at home. These games are all worth looking at, both because many are great games, but also because of the curious changes and differences each version represents. Every arcade game presented here runs great in MAME or Nebula Model 2, so take a second and play some of these great Sega classics. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, I will catch you next time.